Yes. In this session, we have invited two spatial practitioners that also have pedagogical practice. These are Emma Hutte and simply, I don't even know how I pronounce it right, Mambo. You can do it correctly by yourself a little bit later. And the practice shares this year are organized around 4 teams. We've already had the team of spatial, feminist spatial crafts. And further down this year, we will also address feminist spatial world building and the change in architectural practice culture. But today, it's all focused on pedagogies. And I actually, for today, I have also 2 speakers that I know through pedagogical practices. But I don't know them very well. So I'm actually very curious to hear their own stories. So Emma, she is working at the intersection of design and performance. And the moving body is actually central to her practice. And besides this, she's also a sailor, and I find this always a very interesting addition to her work. And I came to know her at the first. Well, actually, we had to come in as critics to see the work of students, and then we were both independently giving critics to projects. And I thought, she knows what she's talking about. So that's why I'm really curious to hear more about her work today. And the same goes from Simply. I met her in South Africa. This is also where she's based, in Johannesburg. And I met her at the Graduate School of Architecture there, where she is also trained and now also doing her pedagogical work. Also, her work is forming or around bodily practices. So this gives another theme to this practice today. Using immersive environments, soundscapes, and bodily experiences, she bridges past and present to predict innovative Black spatial imaginaries. I will ask Emma to present first, and then immediately after, the second presentation is there, and after that, there's room for questions and discussions. And I'm looking forward to hear your stories. So Emma, if you're ready, you can share your screen.
Sure. Hi, everyone. And thanks for having me here to share today. So just set it up. Do that one. No, just make it a little smaller.
Yes, this is perfect.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. So I actually really struggled with how to start a presentation for today, which was really funny, but it was a nice challenge. So I thought I would start actually with this first part of my artist statement or bio or the stuff that I share publicly. Emma Hoyt, working at the intersection of design and performance, the moving body is central in Emma Hoyt's practice. She researches through and mobilizes everyday acts and materials, giving them agency by transforming them into multimedia choreographic projects. And I thought, is that actually understandable? What does that mean? Why do I write that? So I sort of thought I'd unpack it a little bit and sort of see how that works. So the moving body, by that I mean a walking, laying, sitting, rolling, running, excitement-filled body, a fearful body, a pedestrian body, a choreographed body, a lost body, all those sorts of versions, and many, many more that don't fit onto a page here. And it also includes the body and all its senses, its ability through our sensory faculties to receive and perceive information. And by that, I mean both my inside my body, the actual physical workings of my body, and also the body, the moving body as an interface between the external world that I exist in. So then thinking about everyday acts and materials, and that I research through them. So this is working, and that is often in my situation a form of tending: gardens, friendships, bars, students, cafes, all sorts of tending. I realized that cooking comes in there a lot. Collecting as a form of work comes in there a lot. And of course, moving is an everyday act. And I think it's perhaps one of our most shared everyday acts. Then everyday materials, I was thinking about that. And I suppose, I mean, it's often clothing, or it started out often as clothing. It goes into objects, but the everyday material of landscapes, it might be water, the material of memories, and then again, movement becomes a material that I work with, or that I grapple with, wrestle with, maybe. And then choreographic. So a definition of that, the art or practice of designing choreographic sequences. And I find that important, that the word designing is in there with choreographic. Choreographic is also then related with the graphic part to the written notation of such a sequence. Or you could also think of choreography as the art or practice of designing sequences of movement of physical bodies in which motion or form are both specified. Choreography may also refer to the design itself. A choreographer is one who creates choreographies by practicing the art of choreography, a process known as choreographing. This, I suppose, little blurb that I wrote about what I do that tries to encapsulate all of that, in the beginning was really fostered through my bachelor program. And I studied at Parsons School of Design, actually in the integrated design program. So at a design school, even though I was working with the body and came from a background of dance. And the integrated part of that program allowed me to bring the body and movement into conversation with design practices. I suppose through that, I started using the moving body more as a lens through which I observe and register the world around me, rather than an output or a way of displaying something. But there was also a factor in there that I felt somewhat unsupported in really investigating choreography or movement, because I was in a design department. So this fascination with the body was all interesting and good to bring in, but it wasn't that I was really supported in that. And so then I thought, in sort of putting this presentation together, I was like, okay, what did those projects actually look like? So one of those was what I called the daily catalog. And these are scan spreads of a diary that I kept. I took a photo front, back, and close up of what I wore every day. I stuck it in this book, printed it out, stuck it in, and then hand wrote a week later, looking back at those images, what I remembered about the feeling or the relationship between my body and that clothing. So this became a physical book. I suppose in there's the idea of collecting as well. I did this actually over about almost a year. For every day I took these photos and these notes. Then this turned into a performance. So I used that content of the daily catalog, and I made a phrase of movement, and then I performed this exactly the same phrase of movement in all of these different outfits that I'd photographed myself in. So this is where the movement started becoming, it was a performance and people were watching it, but actually for me, it was the moving body was this way of investigating the relationship between the clothing I was wearing and how it choreographed me. So not so much that I was deciding the movements that my body was making, but what could I do in this clothing? Where did I get stuck? Where did I not get stuck? So that's one of the projects that was sort of the beginning of this investigation. But also in that project, in these little gifts here, then you see there's something spatial that I did. Like I set up the stage, I thought about the lighting, I thought about the sound. It was an installation that I happened to be moving in. So then I moved to another project, which I called Invisible Currents. And this began as an exploration of how to see movement. As the dress fills with water, movement becomes legible not only in the dancer's body, but also in the body of water inside the dress. So up here, the dress is empty, I'm moving, and the dress is filling with water, and it's becoming heavier and restricting my movement and altering my movement, even though I'm trying my best to do exactly the same movement, to the point where it becomes unbelievably heavy. And I'm carrying actually this weight on my shoulder. So all of the weight of this water that was inhibiting my movement was carried on my shoulders. And then another version of how this sort of played out, I suppose, this investigation or using everyday acts. I spent some time in Wellfleet, Massachusetts, during residencies there. And during one of those residencies, I followed this fisherman for a whole 2 weeks. And he's an oyster fisherman, and he tends an oyster garden at low tide in the bay there in Wellfleet. So following him for 2 weeks, there were lots of conversations, but I also learnt every movement that he had to make to tend these oyster gardens. And then with the other fellow residents from this residency, I taught them the movements of that work. And Wellfleet is famous for these oysters that fishermen such as Mike produce. And then we performed these work, in a way, rituals, I suppose, and exposed this work that Mike makes every low tide in the center of town on the walk bridge. So this sort of brought up the choice of location, made this unseen labor that was sort of inherently connected to this place visible. You couldn't go through town without seeing it. And then also the structure of this bridge gave reference to a sort of assembly line, which brought up questions of how, if you sort of compartmentalize the work like we do on an assembly line, then you don't actually see the results of that physical labor or that work. So this was an attempt to sort of make that visible. So now in the presentation, I'm going to make an almighty jump. I'd been living in New York City for 10 years and doing this sort of work that I just shared with you. And I moved to Svalbard, which is basically the North Pole. So this is the island, the landmass, and then this is where it is on the world. It's a lot of saying yeses that I won't go into now during this presentation. But when I arrived there, I want to also note in the context of this discussion that I kept myself afloat financially by bartending, a practice that I carried over from New York City. And I also became the coordinator of an artist residency, Arctica Svalbard. I started crewing on ships and sailing quite a lot. I was cooking, I was washing dishes, but all of that allowed me to be in this landscape. But there was also still my moving body that I kept using in movement in this landscape to try and understand it. So this one is on me trying to move. It's almost like relearning to move on polished ice. I think it was about minus 25 degrees, and it was a howling wind. So all of these factors of this particular location and space made my body move differently. This is in a valley not far from the town of Longyearbyen, and the scale understand. So I started sort of trying to measure it with my movement. So then my body became a measuring stick, or my body became the tool that I used to reference this space around me. Through living in Svalbard for full time for a year, and then I kept going back. I still go back, actually. I started developing these site-specific performances, but it was not always that there was actually somebody watching me. Sometimes it was only a camera watching me. Every time it was the landscape watching me. And I called them unravelings. So it's a piece of knitting around my neck, the most vulnerable part of my body, and with a monotonous sort of consuming movement of my hand, I unraveled that protection of my neck and deemed this once valuable protective layer on my body invaluable. And it also, through the action of unraveling, it wrapped my hand, the 26 bones that are normally functional and do everything for us in our hand, became totally useless. They couldn't move anymore. So this became a collection of material, actually. If I'm talking about sort of the material that I work in my practice, this documentation became a collection of material. I then moved back down to mainland, or to London, to do my master's program in creative practice at Laban Conservatory of Dance and Music, but that's a collaboration with Siobhan Davies Dance and Independent Dance in London. And so I'm sharing here some of my notebooks. And I developed a way of every time I moved or was in the studio moving and investigating movement, I would take these notes that were partially text, partially drawing lines, as a way of trying to sort of understand how my body was moving, and also starting to develop this idea of my body as a landscape. This is sort of another part of that practice. A lot of imagery, all imagery I've taken while living in Svalbard and working in Svalbard, then got paired with these notebooks. And then I also started pairing them with images, which are very small to see here, but from anatomical texts, so actual books of the anatomy of the body. And I started finding relations between my body, the landscape, and the way my body was moving. This is another sort of...
You are already past your time.
Okay.
But you can...
Yes, I will speed up.
Yeah, thank you.
So some more parts of sort of this practice of connecting my body and the landscape, connecting work and note-taking while working, and then starting to swap body as landscape, landscape as body, swap these words around and play with definitions of things. And that's where the teaching, or the sort of this swapping of words became really important for how I bring these ideas into teaching. So I started thinking of swapping design and choreography. And this is from Jonathan Burrows. My current definition of design is this: design is about making a choice, including the choice to make no choice. Or perhaps design is this: arranging objects in the right order that makes the whole greater than the sum of the parts. So in sort of being able to swap these two modes, or these two methods around, the choreographic method that I have developed in my practice, but swapping the words around and the definitions around, then I became able to start to see how a choreographic practice and the methods that are within a choreographic practice can become instrumental and maybe really informative in a design practice, And it's the basis of that my teaching is actually based on. So being able to use choreographic methods and offer them to design students, whether they're architectural design, fashion design, product design, all of that. There's lots more I can say about that, but maybe I'm going to leave it here, and then we can also talk about where these, like later in the discussions, where these sort of design practices or this swapping of design and choreography, where that's played out in terms of workshops and teaching.
Thank you very much, Emma. Simply, you can prepare, share your screen and come to the presentation. If you're, yeah, there you are. Thank you.
Here I am. Hi, everyone. Can everybody see a Photoshop PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay. Can we now see Lost in Translation? Okay.
Yes, we can.
Okay. Don't know why it's jumping the gun. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Cynthia. I am an architect, researcher, and interdisciplinary practitioner from South Africa, Johannesburg. I teach at the University of Johannesburg in the undergrad school and the postgraduate school. I am a recent graduate, so I just got my master's in 2022. So I am very new to the game. So I am going to present to you today what I call my mixed tape of unrefined thoughts, and hope you guys can sort of help me and discuss around my interests and my positions around teaching and practice. Okay. So initially, when I started my architectural journey, I was interested in how I was perceived in the world, particularly in a world I was told is home. These projects were projects that I started undertaking in my honors year, where I began to look at the perception of the Black body in space. I could not understand the ways in which I was being read when it was counter to my reality. I started seeing those realities projected in Instagram, the way that Black bodies were being read across the world. The lady in the middle is a lady called Sarah, who was killed. And this is her mugshot, where the conversation became around a conspiracy theory of was she dead or alive when the picture was taken. And this for me was quite jarring when it came to the objectification of the female Black body, even in an instance as vulnerable as this. The same thing happened in South Africa in 2021. We had what we called the looting or the riots of July. And the same thing started to happen in media. I started to see the Black body being projected and read in barbaric ways. Oh, the violence of burning and looting was associated with the conditions that I should describe as my own. And it's as though this is how I am meant to be. What I did in this project in honors year was look at a poem that was written for a freedom fighter named Emmett Till, whose prosecution was read as a suicide. He was told that he jumped out the window. And a poet wrote sort of a piece of poetry that wrote how absurd that conspiracy was in the way that he was found. I used that same logic in poetry to generate images that questioned the same reading of the loot at the time and the bodies and how they were read. So this is just a snippet of that in drawing. Don't know if anyone can hear.
Traffic on the road. I'm looting groceries in hand. I'm taking police in Alexandra. Stand still.
So it's a very small snippet because time, but and then
traffic.
In the next series of work, in my honors year, we were prompted with our first brief. It was called Create the Cyborg. And I struggled because I didn't know how to. My body has always felt like it was an extension of its environment. From birth, I was told by my mother, "Ukuzala uzelula," which means to give birth is to extend yourself. So my feminine Black existence was already an extension. So I felt, how could I draw what I already am? Which prompted me to use my body as a means of drawing the architecture that I felt already housed. which made me question, why do I have these postures, gestures, means of existing, how elegantly my skin and my body is able to hold this weight. But I actually didn't want to hold it. I don't want to be strong. I don't want to hold. I don't want to carry, which made me question, why am I designed to see or feel or exist this way? I then began to study the Black skin as something that is applied. This became really important to me, that the term Black for me, architecturally, spatially, and in my existence, feels like a surface that is applied to my body that has an inherent violence that attaches to me. And I am now meant to live, exist, work between, in and around that violence. I used my architectural master's project to unpack that violence through the body in what I called ukegega, which is an earthquake. And my question was, how do I rupture the skin to find a way to actually read myself and my existence and my practice, my identity for what it truly is, and not from the surface of the applied skin? This led me to my final iteration of my body work, which showed the skin as ash, redefining the axis of how I exist to myself, new readings, new methods, new tactics that I would need to develop in my master's project, which I've left out because it's no longer body work. And I want to talk about that quite particularly because what this actually did was counterintuitive. It traumatized me because of the display of my body created an instance where I have the inability to access my own work. This is just a short film of the extracted images.
Uyaziphosa njengoba aqala ukukhumbula.
Okay, I'm going to stop this here for time purposes. Apologies. This prompted me to create a second series of work where I express architecturally how I feel the skin was to rupture in a speculative cartography that begins to use apartheid spatial planning, the body movements, the body identifications, and uses the climate tactic of geology in order to break and rupture where I could exist in space and why. So the tactics and the methods that I'm interested in are body and cartography as well. This led me to practice differently with my students in class, which is what I'm going to show you, where I first started with the sentence, to dismantle the master's house, you will never use the master's tools, which I found quite interesting, which prompted me to ask, so how do I teach students differently when all I have are the master's tools? Which then prompted me to think about language. English is not good for us. We can't define ourselves. We can't think through ourselves. But what does that mean to teach students where the textbook only allows them to understand themselves in one way? I call this the act of translating to ununderstand. What I wanted to teach was the act of understanding and not translation. So in the first year with my students, what I did was call it the Atlas, because again, we do have to use the English language. It's a predominantly English school, where I started to ask students to look into the continent. So I teach interdisciplinary design and architecture. I asked students to look into the continent, find words, tactics, tribes, artifacts, and really begin to unpack and discover what those mean and how would they display and create other pieces or forms of art or forms of architecture that begin to help them interrogate how they see themselves in the world, but particularly within the continent. The second phase of the project led into what I did with them in 2022, which is what I started to call the one-to-one project, where the body started to come back, but not in the way that traumatized myself. To the point that Emma made, the body started being used as a tool of measurement, a tool of understanding, and a tool of reading. How do we use the body to read space, to read dimension, to read narrative, to read identity? They were in what is Afropunk, and they used the Afropunk event to generate narratives, films, manifestos, and one-to-one body style projects where they go through, because we have multiple departments here, fashion, industrial design, interior design, to form and manifest different pieces of architecture. Okay. Last year, the one-to-one project went into its third cycle, where I really got a chance to get students into the making factory, where they really started to generate objects through the module in order to understand how to build and make in a tactile way, where they start to understand the scale of their hands versus the scale of their chest versus the scale of their entire body, and how that influences the way that they understand identity making, artifact making, and really start to interrogate the positions of self. These are second years, so we could only take the project so far. But what I learned from my students was that the act of artifact making and the act through the body is something that is understood universally. It does not have to be spoken, it does not have to be read, but it is definitely understood. So the body became a tool for me to not untranslate or translate, but to understand and practice. Thank you. I hope I didn't go over time.
Oh, thank you so much. You didn't go over time, otherwise I would have. Thank you. Thank you very much for your beautiful presentation. So, oh yeah, I saw already people clapping, Zoom clapping. So actually, yeah, I would like to invite everybody to join the conversation, which also means if you feel comfortable with it, join with your video so we don't have to talk to black spots. And if you have, you're very welcome to either raise your hand or put a question in the chat so we can start the conversation. I'm actually just, I don't know, processing your information and also thinking about the value of your practice in relation to the pedagogy. You know, how much do the students influence your work and how much do they empower your work or question your work? So this is a question that goes to both of you. And I'm very curious to hear that.
I could go first if that's okay.
Yeah, of course.
I think for me, my students influence the value of the practice quite a bit, because for myself, the practice was generated when I was a student. So I think I keep calling it trauma because it felt like it, kind of to have my body printed out. And it's like, this is a great project, and people kind of have proximity to me and are able to go, oh, that's you. And I forget that it's not about the project. And I go, people looking at my thighs, because there's sort of like an objectification of the Black female body that I'm just accustomed to, that made sort of using myself as the object of research really painful to experience. And I think when I thought about how I approached this project with the students, I had to be quite conscious of that, because I don't know what that has the potential to do. So I think in terms of the students really making me aware of what it means to practice with the body, does not necessarily mean to put the body on display all the time, which is sort of how I initially thought practicing with the body works. So I think having to really think about the experience of a student and what they take away truly influenced the way I thought about body practice. But also the initial, what's the word I'm looking for? Conflict I had with students about asking them to work at the scale of 1-to-1, particularly architecture students are like, but we don't work at that scale. We work at 1 in 5, we work in 1 in 10, we work in 1 in 100, 1 in 500. What do you mean we're working at the 1-to-1? That's not what architects do. So that initial conflict was a hurdle and a half to get over. But I think when students got to a point where they understood how valuable the body is as a tool to understand space making, even for myself, it made me go, oh, so I wasn't saying something that doesn't make sense. So I think the students have a very big relationship, or relationship to how I start to understand body as a practice, and particularly femininity as a practice in a male-dominated field like architecture. Yeah.
That's a very nice answer, and I can also very much relate to that in terms of, you know, asking for performative acts or one-to-one work. I can totally relate to the conflict. And actually, you helped me to understand why it is so important, because you more clearly raised like the question of transformation and how to start transformation if you only have the master's tools. And then the body in your work, I see it as an answer to this question. And you also, well, present and work with the body in such a way in your pedagogical work. And I'm wondering if this also brings out the transformation you were hoping for with the students.
I think for myself, no. I actually got a lot of critique from my students for my project. And I think that it was rightfully so. So we have a legacy, I think, of Black female bodies being put on display for testing, assessment, gawking, voyeuring. So I think for students in my context, it actually felt counterintuitive to do that, to be like, oh, we're developing a new practice, but they sort of read it as, but you're doing the same thing, but it's even worse because you're doing it to yourself. So I think in that instance, the transformation was really in the critique of the practice of displaying the body, that I got quite heavily from my students, which I thought was valid at the time. I still quite think it's valid. But what it did also teach us is to think about the body as not something that needs to display, test, materialize. It perhaps is something that measures. So it does not necessarily have to be part and parcel of the product. So maybe that's where it became really helpful. But I think in the way that the project was executed, it brought up a lot of unanswered questions for sort of Black female practitioners about, is this the only way we can communicate? And if so, it's quite a violent way to tell us to communicate ourselves.
Oh, but it's interesting if you then propose the shift of the body as measurement, because then also architecturally it opens up to different ways and different practices. That's yeah. Then I'm really curious to hear from Emma.
Yeah, I think I can. It's an interesting question of whether the students empower or influence the practice, and it's interesting to also hear your perspective, Simpwe, of how that plays out. And obviously, there's big differences for me in that sense. And it makes me think of one thing that I often start my workshops with. So whether it's architectural students or interior architecture, and often I come in as the one to give a workshop. So I'm sort of not always the one that is their regular permanent tutor, but rather coming in as a thing that they can try out and they can judge and they can decide whether they like it or not. But it's not always a fixed part. And one of the things that I often ask them at the very beginning is, who of you has a movement practice? And normally everybody shies away from it and says, no, I don't have a movement practice. And then I say, okay, so could one of you describe your morning routine to me? Like, what did you do this morning? How did you get here this morning? And generally through that description, it's a whole lot of action words. It's a whole lot of doing and moving their bodies. And so what I notice with that is it becomes a really, a sort of really open and almost non-judgmental. It's not like moving, and the body then becomes not something special. I mean, it is special because of obvious reasons, but it's not something that we need to judge or be precious about, because all of us rolled over at the moment that we woke up, and all of us somehow stood up, and all of us somehow moved with our body from maybe our bedroom to the bathroom. So I think that is sort of a starting point often in my teaching with students. almost puts us all on the same level. Oh, we're all movers. We all have a body. We all move our body, and we all interact with the world around us and other people through that body. And so it through that becomes something really not special. I don't have the right word for it, but it's not a drama in that way, which I always find really sort of productive. And it allows them then to start, a bit like you're saying, using the body as a tool rather than using it as something to present an idea, or using it as an object to be seen as the sort of outcome of a project. It really, from that ground level, becomes a tool that we use to investigate relationships, to investigate concepts, to investigate the space around us.
Yeah, thank you very much. In relation to that, we also have a question in the chat, and also a comment by Ishita already. We are all movers, simply yet so strong. But actually, the other Emma raised a very nice question, and maybe you want to ask it yourself, Emma? Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious, because I think when we're in class and when we're in a sort of a teaching environment, we can have these beautiful aha moments of inspiration. And I'm just curious how it translates, or how you've seen kind of what you've given the students in these workshops, how it translates into kind of their underlining knowing of the built environment, and how using the body and having this sort of like bodily awareness of how we move in space and use the body as a tool and relate to others, and somatic awareness, like if you've noticed how that changes the work of your students in terms of how they're actually designing the built environment or perceiving of the built environment. So it's kind of a big question, but just if you've noticed anything.
I'd love to. One of the practices or systems that I have with teaching workshops is actually something I borrow from a collaborator that I worked with in London. I ask students to leave a note in the room after the workshop for me. And it's either something interesting, something useful, or something surprising that happened. And I actually pulled a couple of these out that I thought might come in useful to share with you guys. And I think it speaks to what your question is. But so after a workshop, there's one here that says, trust and collaborate with those around me. It says, it was useful to try and think about a 3-dimensional composition in space and no longer try to do that on a 2-dimensional surface of a computer. So sort of, I suppose I read that as bringing up this idea that, okay, we might have to work 2D to present or to share or to communicate things, but we can do a lot of the figuring out in 3D with our body as the material first. It was useful to create a connection with people around me and also with the space around me. And then this one I really love, taking play seriously while sharing collective moments. So I thought that sort of, yeah. So I don't know if that sort of answers a little bit of your question, but it seems to me that there's an openness to play often after these workshops, which I think can be really productive. It's serious play. And also there seems to be more acknowledgement of relationships, and whether that's between themselves and other bodies, or themselves and the space and the environments that we're inhabiting. And that seems to play out then in perhaps the research they end up doing for another project, or the way they go about researching. They'll sort of put themselves in the research process earlier than just staying as a container of the research.
Do you also have a comment to this one? Yeah.
Oh, yes. Thank you so much for your question. I think it's really great. This is all said in hindsight. I actually wasn't monitoring it, so the questions actually made me think about that quite carefully. My students are like 2 years in, so I haven't seen them practice anything. That's what I have to start by acknowledging that. I hope it's gonna have an influence in like 5-10 years time. I hope I see the context shift somewhere. So I don't want to put that weight on them, but I haven't necessarily seen it in practice. But what I have seen in studio though, with the way that they designed in their own little way, is they now, because the body was interrogated, and particularly because I have students of color in my class, so a lot of my students are Black students, they feel that their way of reading the world is legitimate. Because what our context tends to do a lot is gaslight a Black practitioner into thinking the way that you're reading the world is not actually what the world is, right? So no, but look, your world is technologically advanced. Oh, but look, it's this. Oh, but look, it's that, right? So a lot of the times they have to look outside of themselves to what they think is real, what they think is necessary, what they think is relevant. So when they use the body as a tool to read and measure, it's not necessarily about saying, they now have the answers, but they know how to actually view the world, and they've understood that the built fabric is actually a means that produces this misconception of themselves as well. So in knowing that and in legitimizing the way that they see the world, they design and intervene with a lot more confidence, with a lot more veracity, with a lot more intention. They know how to read the world and take sort of what they understand as material condition and understand what the implications of those are. So I think in a little way, the practice of the body has created more confident students, which is something that is rare in architecture school. And it's something that I didn't have the privilege to experience. So I've heard students challenge our briefs, which to me is a brilliant thing, that they're able to say, but my understanding, but my association, but my way that I move through the world is questionable in the way that you write the brief. So how do I see myself? And just having the means to be able to do that is because you've been able to use the body as an antenna, as a way to understand the fabric of the world. So I think more than anything else, it's produced students with confidence, with compassion, with care, but with interest in the way that the world is developing around them. And maybe some of them become architects with an A and they build buildings. Some are going to become historians. Some are just going to become artists and architects as side hustles, and that's okay. But we're not losing them in the profession because they don't feel legitimate in the space. So I think it might not necessarily be built yet, but I do see a culture building from the practice that I'm really interested to see where it goes.
Thank you. That's a beautiful answer. It also reminds me a little bit of, when we have discussions in the Feminist Spatial Practices community about pedagogies, we often have this, like, on the one hand, feminism is often perceived as an issue of representation. But what we are talking about and what you are giving as a perfect example of is, like, these practices, they foreground overlooked lived experiences and forms of spatial knowledge that are actually vital to create transformative spaces and to work differently. And I see very much in both of your work how working with the body can do that and can offer that. Even though other questions might pop up, because again, you use a female body. And if you start, I don't know, presenting that in somehow in your presentations, it raises different questions. But then if you go back to the actual movement and the awareness that that might create, suddenly all these different kind of experiences pop up. And this is also, to me, a little bit what Emma was talking about. Like, then you make it accessible for everybody to talk about the tiny experience that they just had when they were, I don't know, getting out of bed. And for some people that was hard, and for other people that was easy, or for some people that had to do with sound, and for others with taste or texture. And then the conversation becomes totally different. Emma, yeah?
Yeah, I think there's something on that note that I'd like to sort of also bring up that I really think about when I'm teaching at the moment. Are these sort of coined terms of like embodied knowledge, embodied research, embodied methods, and it sort of feels at the moment that it's like, wow, we're discovering this new thing, this new way of working, and it's, you know, being published about and it's being written about everywhere. And sometimes I think it's also important to sort of take a step back and be like, hey, this isn't new, using your body. Like, this is actual, the fact that we're in a way rediscovering it, or that it's becoming so prominent now or so important now in design education, is because we've forgotten it. Like, it's and a lot of our technological advances, as incredible as they are, they have taken away our physical actions. And I think, you know, we have all been doing embodied research since the moment that we were born. That's how we've generated any knowledge that we have. We reached out and we touched something, and then we sort of thought, oh, it'd be nice to roll over there and have a look at it. So we figure out how to roll over there and have a look at it. Like, it is embodied research that has, for all of us, generated a huge amount of the knowledge and understanding of the world around us. And so I also, in my teaching, try to sort of remember that again, that it's not new, but it's an option that we have to add to our research, and we shouldn't ignore it. Or it's an option that we have to add to our practice, and we shouldn't ignore it or disregard it. It has the same weight as any other form of research, and it should be in dialogue with what we're doing.
Yeah, and then if you are trained in a program where this is not the case, or work in a profession where this is not acknowledged, it's sometimes so difficult, and then you find it and you think, oh, it's so beautiful that it is there. And then there's a kind of work of remembering yourself all the time. This is what we can work with. And then this also, to me, this also relates to the comment Bilge just made in the chat. While practicing the movement, we transform the space as well. It's not about, we're not talking about, you know, bodies moving in space. It is very much about reciprocity and the relation that you build. And I think also the movements and the procedures you were talking about, Emma, with the fishing and all this way we relate to the habit and the habitats are very much part of that. Are there other questions from the audience right now? We are heading towards the end of our practice, and I see Ruro has a hand raised, so feel free to speak.
Hi. Yeah, thank you so much for the presentations and discussion. It's super interesting. I have some questions for both of you. First, Emma, I'm super taken by your comments on like the focus on everyday life, saying that it is not a drama, right? But I'm wondering how you reflect that comments against, for example, movement in the North Pole against the scenery, which is pretty dramatic. And then a technical question for you. I'm super intrigued by the water dance. I'm wondering, how does the water accumulate? Initially, I was thinking it's sweat, but that cannot be. So super fascinated by that, and would love to know. And then with Stefan, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but I'm super also taken by lots of aspects in your presentation. Maybe just one thing I have always also been thinking around that, how do we critique the master narrative, the language using the tool, which seems not avoidable for me, like even by focusing with body, with matter, with embodied experience, because once it becomes symbolic. Once it start to be engaged in a conversation, a discourse, there's already language imposed, projected on it in order to start to make meaning. So I was wondering if you have any thoughts around that. Thank you both, humans.
These were many questions at once. So maybe first, Emma.
Sure, I can. Technical question, I was attached to a hose at my neck. So the choreography allowed me to move in and out of the hose, and the hose was slowly filling the dress as I moved. It didn't turn out very well all the time. Got quite tangled at times. The not dramatic body. I missed a little bit of your question, but I think I understand, like, are you sure that it's not dramatic for everybody? So whenever I use the term body, that's including absolutely everybody. I know this body that I'm in, and I know it quite well. I've had a lot of interactions with a lot of other bodies, but I am not those other bodies. I will never be those other bodies. So all I can do is try to understand my own body in order to empathize, understand, relate to, find connections with, as much as possible, every other type of body that inhabits this world. But for me, the word body encompasses absolutely everybody of abilities, comforts, sizes, shapes, like the whole gamut of it is in there in that one word for me. And of course, we have different abilities, different comforts, different ways of moving. Some will be more dramatic than others, but the non-dramatic part that I'm talking about is the fact that that's shared by all of us, that we are moving in some capacity, and we share that there's differences between all of us. We can't all be the same. So that's what I mean by the non-dramatic, and it's not meant to disregard people that have, or bodies that have, different abilities.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your question. Oh, by the way, the pronunciation of my name, Simpiwe. Yeah. Okay. So, to your question about the master's tools, I think we have, particularly in my context, we have that debate a lot. But there's something profound one of our professors said was, we perceive architecture or built environment as being the master's house. But he makes a point to say, but we were part and parcel of the construction of that house. So how is it not my house too, right? So I was provoked with that to ask myself, but does it mean if it's sophisticated and technological and outside of your scope that it isn't equally your house? And that was quite jarring to me. And I went, wait, what do you mean? So I'm trying to dismantle me? And then he said, perhaps. So I think for myself, when it came to the master's house and the master's tools, it really started to change into a conversation about not seeing myself as the other, not seeing my practice as the opposite to something or in contrast to something. And once I started to lens what our practices are, what my thinking is, what my students' thinking is, positions from the African continental context, not as something that has to sit in contrast to, or has to sit in objection to, or has to sit in conflict too, but within and of and around and with each other. I think that for me was a little bit more liberating, because it allowed me to understand myself first as a position and a legitimate practice that has to be explored. And it sort of made me understand that it's not that I don't have a master house and I don't have master tools, I just haven't documented them. I maybe perhaps lost them along the way. So it became a thing about trying to discover what those are. So I am kind of, I know I brought up the statement, but in hindsight, I think I no longer have an interest about breaking the master's house. It's about finding my master house and my master tools and my master constructions within the world that currently exists. So I'm no longer interested in the conflict, seeing myself as the other two, but seeing myself as the thing I'm interested in, seeing my existence as the thing I'm interested in. acknowledging that it exists in a climate and a world that is hindering its movements, hindering its progression, propelling it in some instances. But I think the statement for me reads a bit differently in hindsight. I don't have an interest in breaking a house that isn't my own. I don't have a purpose for that anymore. I'm kind of more interested in figuring out how my houses were built, how my tools were drawn, how my tools were made, and how those are beneficial to me now, within the constraints and the constructs of the world. So can we generate cracks? Can we generate punctures? Can we generate plasters rather than complete dismantles? Perhaps might be the next thing. But I also love the people that want to dismantle too. We all have a place. The world is big. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. It also reminds me of your reaction to a discussion about dismantling and breaking down with the answer of compassion. At least do it with compassion.
You're gonna break with compassion.
Yeah, and that was also very valuable to me. Yeah, unfortunately, we have to end the conversation today, and I see all kinds of lovely and appreciative comments popping up in the chat, praising you for your work, but also for the agency you give to your students to figure things out themselves and react to your pedagogy through letters or by being critical. Yeah, and I mean, there's too much to say, and there's definitely much more to practice and figure out. And I hope we can keep in contact and keep on sharing each other's work and keep inspired and not feel alone in this context. So thank you very much for today. And thank you all for being here and joining. And I wish you all either a good evening or a good next session of your workday for those who are on the other side of the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.